my master's of commerce degree at the University of Cape Town in development economics. And right now I'm working on further graduate studies in international relations at Trinity College in Dublin. So yeah, very excited to have this conversation on the, on fiscal policy and the macroeconomy during COVID-19. And yeah, very keen. So can we just have some brief introductions, let's say about a minute a speaker, and then we will start with the presentations. So yeah, Angelica, could you briefly introduce yourself?
Okay, hello everyone. Firstly, I would like to, this is Dr. Angelica Njuguna from Kenyatta University. Okay, I am a senior lecturer and I'm teaching econometrics and quantitative methods. I'm currently the chairman of the department, econometrics and statistics in the School of Economics. So I would like to thank the REFA group for inviting me to talk in this very important gathering. And we hope that we will all learn from the presentation today. Thank you.
Jason, can you go next, and then Peterson?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. Hi, my name is Jason Braganza, and I'm the Executive Director at the African Forum and Network on Debt and Development. Normally based in Nairobi, but currently joining you from London. Very glad to be here and very excited to be with Peterson and Angelica during this conversation. Thanks.
Okay, so my name is Peterson, Dr. Peterson. I work at the central bank as an economist. I do a lot of studies on global issues, and once in a while I look to Africa, I look into Europe, and then I do a bit of going around the world, to understand what's going on in the macroeconomy. So I'm currently the technical assistant to Deputy Governor Economic Policy, which I think puts me in a position to speak on these issues, and I'm quite glad that I'm with fellow colleagues here, Jason, Angelica. Thank you.
Great, thank you for your introductions, and we're very excited for the discussion ahead. So can we please begin with the presentations? And I had asked, I think, Peterson to go first.
Okay, thank you. So my presentation will be a bit short and a bit straight to the point, and then I could elaborate more at the question sessions. So just to, can you see my screen? That should, yeah. Okay, so today I'll be talking about, I'll be discussing more about how the COVID event, pandemic, and how the COVID pandemic has confounded fiscal policy in Africa. For example, I'll talk about how the need to reduce the hardship on citizens, and the need to also raise revenue, the need to also manage the macroeconomy, and also the need to repay debt, how these competing objectives actually confound fiscal policies in African countries. And then I'll identify some of the issues, then discuss about the way forward, and then also talk about the future after COVID, after the COVID pandemic. So I'll begin by describing the debt problem. I've spoken a lot about this in my papers, and I have pointed out that if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, you see that the public debt to GDP ratio is above 58%. And then for North Africa alone, during the pandemic, it's 88%, which is a large number. And if you do a debt sustainability analysis, a DSA analysis, you see that this number is something that is alarming and should, I mean, any policymaker should actually be disturbed by this number. Then if you look towards the right, you see that in 2019, for the sub-Saharan African region, you see that the public debt to GDP ratio was just 6%. And then in COVID, it skyrocketed to, it jumped over 50%. So this is something that
Sorry, Peterson, can I ask, is there any chance that you can get closer to your mic, or if you have
Oh, sorry, you can hear me. Okay, sorry about that. Yes.
That's
okay.
So much clearer, much better. Thank you very much.
Okay. All right.
Great.
So the slide I have on the left, we can see what is actually happening during the pandemic in 2020. And then on the left, we can see what happened. We can see that in 2019, the public to debt ratio was a bit single digit 6%. And then in 2020, it's way above 50%. So it shows how African countries have taken so much debt. I mean, partly to cope with the crisis and partly to pay off debt. I mean, to repay maturing debt, and then partly to you know, to spend on consumption, to reduce the hardship on people, on citizens caused by the pandemic. And then if the total debt stock before the pandemic was about 547 billion that was owed to different lenders, private lenders, multinationals and banks. And then for the most heavily indebted countries, we also observed that debt servicing payments, that's the repayment of interest and principal, exceeded 40% of GDP for African countries that are heavily indebted. Now, that's something that the World Bank and IMF have actually been concerned about and have been pointing out in their international debt statistics. And then if you look at social spending and spending on welfare and healthcare, I mean, we have almost 1/5 of African countries have spent more on paying debt than they have spent on social welfare and healthcare combined. So when we look at these issues, I mean, it kind of puts into perspective why there is a debt problem and why we need to have some serious conversations about this. And of course, during the crisis, I mean, we have almost 70% of African countries, actually 47 of 55 actually reported that they actually sought external help, you know, from the United States, from China, from the IMF, from the World Bank. And, you know, for most countries that took these loans, they took these loans to repay maturing loans so that, of course, you don't run into sovereign default. And then, because if you do that, then foreign lenders will find it difficult to lend, or perhaps they'll give you the premium, which some countries, some of our countries, our African countries may not be able to afford. So now, I want to quickly rush into how this has confounded fiscal policy. So during the pandemic, right, if you cannot increase taxes because businesses need relief, right? So if you increase taxes, then you will be able to generate revenue to pay your debt, but then you could witness widespread protest. You could, I mean, and a lot of disruption by citizens. You know, there could be some revolt about that. If you lower taxes during the pandemic, of course, you have provided relief to households, but then you cannot generate revenue to pay your debt, to pay like maturing debt obligations. And then if we go to the other arm of fiscal policy, if you increase spending during the crisis, well, okay, I mean, you could boost aggregate demand, but then you also have to watch inflation and be very careful about inflation. And then if we go into the monetary policy side of macroeconomic policy, you can decrease interest rates to boost economic activities, but then you need to worry about the lag issues. You know, for some African countries, it could take 6 months for monetary policy to be felt in the economy. For some countries, it could take, for South Africa, I think it takes lesser, about 3 to 4. For countries like Ghana and Nigeria, it takes about approximately 4 to 5 months. So every country is different in terms of how long it takes for monetary policy to reflect in the economy. And then if you increase money supply, I mean, like what happened in Zimbabwe some years ago, if you increase money supply, you can get money to repay your debt, but you can have very serious inflation issues. So how do you deal with this problem how do you deal with this problem when fiscal policy is being constrained by the need to deal with the COVID, deal with the economic pressure, and also to repay and manage your debt? So you could consider debt forgiveness, but debt forgiveness also comes with issues. If you forgive the debt, of course, the government will be able to save revenue, which they can then use to invest in the country, infrastructure. But then the bad side to debt forgiveness is that creditors in the foreign credit markets tend not to lend to countries whose debt have been forgiven, because it signals inability to repay, right? So if we consider the second option, which could be debt payment suspension, well, that's also good, because of course you preserve government revenue, which you can of course temporarily, but then the only bad side to this is just that for the suspension period, it will be difficult to get new loans from lenders. And then of course we have what they call a debt swap, where if you're forgiving your debt, if a country is forgiving the debt they owe, then they have to be conditions, right? Where, okay, for example, if the World Bank forgives the debt that Kenya owes, for example, then Kenya will have to invest in climate change, in green projects, several conditionalities, for example. Now, we could also consider debt restructuring, which a lot of countries have begun to think about. And from the data we have, debt suspension appears to be a bit more appropriate in this sense, because what you want to do is you want countries who are heavily indebted to suspend payment for now and then repay when the economies are back on the trajectory of growth. So the World Bank currently is leading a move towards a debt suspension for heavily indebted countries in the world. And currently we have 35 countries, African countries, 35, that have subscribed to that program. So, I mean, it shows you that African countries, a large number of African countries actually feel that they have a debt problem, that they need help. And that's why they've all participated in this program. So for the future, what do we need to begin to think about when it comes to after the COVID crisis? So we need to rebuild our health systems. We need to strengthen our capacity to respond to crisis. We need to build fiscal buffers in good years. So when you have, in good times, you need to save more, increase taxes, generate more revenue, which can then be saved and then used to support the economy in bad times. And then we also need to seriously think about how to reduce our debt burden, our dependence on debt. So thank you. I think that's all for me for now.
Great. Thank you for that. Please can we have our next speaker, Dr. Angelica?
All right. Thank you very much again for inviting me. I'm going to talk about the looming debt crisis in sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, what I'm going to present is actually largely taken from the paper that I have written with colleagues. That is on looming debt crisis, financed by the Open Society Foundation. And it is published by the Political Economy Research Institute by the University of Amherst in the USA. Okay, so the study actually explored the trend patterns and drivers of the debt accumulation in Africa. So let me start first with the big picture. Okay, I don't know whether people can see my slide. So anyway,
we can see.
You can see? Okay, there's a problem, I think. Just a moment. Okay, so anyway, there is this rhetoric early on, before the COVID-19, that Africa actually is a continent on the rise. And there is this negative rhetoric to a positive rhetoric. So when at the turn of the century, 2000, the World Bank actually published a book that is called Can Africa Claim the 21st Century? So in this book, they have described how the Africa will enter into the millennium with a lot of problems, poverty, inequality, social problems, diseases, and a lot of things. Okay, so the rhetoric is very negative. And after some time, there's this working paper published by Salai Martin and Pitkowski in 2010, and they say that Africa poverty is actually falling and much faster than people think. And they say that starting in 1995, poverty actually has started falling in Africa. And contrary to what many people believe, that Africa's growth is being driven by resources, you know, those a lot of resource endowment. So actually, it is on the contrary, a lot of countries that are non-resource rich are actually growing. So there's another rhetoric by the economists in March 2013, and they have written their famous article on Africa Rising, a Hopeful Continent. In this article, they say that there is actually a lot of improvement, especially in the social aspect of growth. For example, there is already high enrollment level, diseases, incidence of diseases has gone down, and a lot of people has improved the standard of living. And also, some more articles said that there is also an increasing number of people in the belonging to a middle class income. However, this all positive rhetoric is actually at stake due to the accumulation of debt, which prompted concern about the possibility of looming debt crisis. And also, we know that this is going to be aggravated by the current COVID-19 pandemic. All right, so I want to show, just a moment. Okay, I want to show the big picture. Okay, again, since 2000, of course, the African countries are growing well, and I just started the historical growth from 2010, which is Africa growth by 5.6, and it has been growing well until there is a slip in 2016, and towards the 2017 to 2019, so growth has started to go down. Okay, although from 2010 to 2018, if we get the average, we will get an average of, let me see, what is my average? It is about 3.8, which is actually, in fact, also the third highest growth in the world, before South Asia and East Asia. However, we can see that all of this growth that we are seeing in the past went, crashing. In 2020, the growth, African growth, has dipped to minus 2.4%, and we know that has a lot of implication on the living standard of the people, and also providing social services to the people. So, okay, how about I also want to have a big picture on the external debt. Okay, so here I'm presenting here the historical figure from 1980 to 2018. So we can see that from 2008 there seems to be accelerated accumulation of debt. Okay, so from 2006 we have about 293 billion USD. Then from 2018 it increases to about 644 billion, and the latest figure that is given to us is that the total Africa's total external debt is about 729 billion USD. So meaning from 2006 to 2021, the African's total external debt seems to have increased or by 300%, meaning it has been tripled. Why we are referencing to 2006 is because this is the time where a lot of African countries, the high indebted poor countries, or HIPIC, has received debt relief by the through the program of called the Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative. Okay, so let's see. We want to ask this analytical and policy question about the African debt. Is there a looming debt crisis in Africa? Okay, why do we ask this question? Firstly, we want to ask this question because it has some implication on the policies. If the African countries are having this debt crisis, therefore they need to contain their debt, and secondly, they have to generate more revenue to finance the debt servicing. Okay, the other question is Africa different? So we have seen here that although we can see that sub-Saharan Africa has the lowest accumulated total external debt compared to other regions in the world. However, although we are seeing that, and if we also compare the debt ratios to GDP, we can find that Africa has only about 55% debt of GDP percent compared to the world average of 255%. Now, we have to be cautious about comparing the GDP ratios because, for example, even if Africa has a lower debt ratio than the rest of the world, countries like Japan, USA, and UK, they are actually borrowing in terms of their currency, and with a very, very low interest rate. However, for Africa, they are borrowing in terms of dollars, yen, and pound, and therefore, if there is depreciation of currency, then there will be a lot of problem. Okay, so here there are more figures here. We can see that in the 90s, the sub-Saharan Africa is the blue one. They have a runaway, very, very high debt. Yeah, that's why in here, in 2006, we see that it fell because they have received, a lot of them receive debt relief. However, if you now see from 2010, in the last decade, you'll see that again, it is accelerating. The accumulation of debt is accelerating, and the question is whether the gains that derived from the MDRI or the multilateral debt relief initiative is going to be eroded, is going to be jeopardized, because now again they seems to be going to that direction of the high debt ratio in the 90s. Okay, so now there are more figures here. We see here the comparison of the sub-Saharan Africa to other regions of the world. So we see again here that in the 2000, okay, so the ratio, that ratio is 67. It went to 27 in 2010. Then now again it is accelerating to 49%. And we know that during the COVID-19 pandemic, there are many of these African countries have resorted to debt, loans to finance the pandemic, how to finance their spending, and also how to help people during the pandemic. Okay, so there are more statistics here. Okay, I'm not going to spend more time because I have only 15 minutes. And as you can see here, there's a distribution of number of South African countries that have government debt as percent of GDP. So as we can see here, already there are only 4 African countries out of 37 that has debt less than 30%. So as you can see also, there are many countries now in Africa where debt is actually greater than 50%. Okay, so you can see the transition from 2010. A lot of them have debt less than 30%. However, in 2018, only 4 of them has debt of less than 30%. And okay, in 2010, there are 9 countries that has debt greater than 50, but less than 70. But in 2018, the number has increased. Okay, so I have many more figures there, but okay, I'm not going. The same story is happening. Okay, now in terms of debt service as percent of export, why is it important to analyze that? Is because the African countries generate their foreign exchange. One of them is through export. So we can see here that okay, many countries. Okay, we have distributed them. Okay, so at least right now, I mean, in 2017, only there are 16% of African countries are spending less than 5% of their export for debt servicing. But however, if you compare the 2010 and 2017 figures, you can see that the number of countries that is graduating to a higher debt service as percent of export is also increasing. Okay, so is domestic, okay, let me see. Now, aside from the external debt, the African countries are also now considering a large amount of borrowing from the domestic market. So, is the domestic debt a problem? Okay, there are costs and benefits associated with domestic borrowing. For example, one of the benefits of the domestic borrowing is the government can easily go to the domestic market to borrow funds to finance government project, and it's very easy to do it. And secondly, the other benefits is through government domestic borrowing, it helps the country to develop its financial system because they provide alternative for the investors to be able to have their money invested, and therefore also it will have a check on inflation. However, there are also costs associated with domestic borrowing. Firstly, it is more expensive than external debt, and secondly, it is what we call a crowding out effect, meaning instead of the bank lending the private investors, the resources are now being shifted to the government to use it to finance their spending. Okay, so what we observe is domestic debt makes up about half of the total debt stock in many countries. Okay, so we have said this already, domestic debt is more expensive, and there's also a concern over debt of state-owned companies. Yeah, so they're losing money because this debt is being mismanaged. Okay, so here there's an example that domestic debt is more expensive than foreign debt because, for example, in Kenya, in 2013, the domestic interest percent to total debt is about 76%, and 55% of the domestic, there are 55% of the domestic debt is 55% of the total debt. Okay, although it has gone down in 2018. Now, one of the example of parastatal sector debt crisis is the example of South Africa, this one of Exxon gross debt. From 2009, it has grown from 74 million rand to 441 million rand. So see how it has been increasing without a check. So here, there's a note here that 9%, Exxon's debt is 9% of the GDP. Okay, so let's see. Okay, what? How many more minutes?
Sorry, there's 2 more minutes.
Okay, okay. So
Cool.
let's see. So now we are also noted that we have new creditors, and a lot of African countries are now borrowing from China. Then let me do the important aspect. The main drivers of debt accumulation in Sub-Saharan Africa is financing gap. There's a gap between savings and the demand for investment. There's also the growth and interest rate, and there's also commodity export and international price shock, where in the commodity export, those countries that are rich in resources, when there is a price shocks internationally, and the commodity prices go down, then they need to borrow in order for them to finance their spending. Okay, I will not do that anymore. Okay, what are the implications of debt accumulation in the economy? Firstly, excessive debt leads to debt overhang, which can have a negative impact on the economy by discouraging domestic and foreign investment. There's also decline in capital accumulation, and the immediate impact is slower economic growth. The rising debt service obligation also forces countries to raise government revenue and therefore increasing taxes. There's also a pressure for cutting expenditure to meet debt service commitments. And therefore, the policy issues, the countries need to generate more revenue so that they can service their debt. They need to do some export diversification and expenditure management. These are the ones that countries need to do for them to be able to do the servicing of their debt. And also countries need to be responsible in lending and borrowing. I mean, the lending are the ones who are lending the countries. Both of them, lenders and borrowers, should be responsible. And also, we want to promote transparency and accountability in debt management. Okay, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much for your presentation. Can everyone see me? Is my audio fine?
Yes.
Yep.
Is.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much for that. Really great presentation. Can we move on to Jason? I just have to say, have to be strict on time because after 1 hour, 15 minutes, the webinar stops. So I think that we need to just keep the time so we can have some time to answer the questions as well. But thanks for that presentation. And Jason, please take the floor.
Thank you very much for the presentations. I will take this up that the civil society person has been the one to be warned about time. We always complain about space for civil society, so I may have to take this up later, but that's just on a light note. Nonetheless, let me share my screen so that we can crack on. So look, I think I want to thank Peterson and Angelica for their presentations, and I want to build up actually from some of their comments that they have presented, and really to put to the audience, first and foremost, an understanding of what Africa's debt crisis really looks like. 54 different countries, 54 different experiences, so very heterogeneous. And therefore, when we're thinking about the current debt crisis, we need to take a couple of steps back and first of all, not blame COVID-19 for the debt crisis, but rather blame COVID for accelerating the debt crisis that the continent is actually facing. So I think that's the first point I'd like to make, because we were, as a continent, headed in that direction. The indicators were very clear that we were going to be faced with this sort of crisis. The second point is around the economic structure of the continent. It's still very much built or based around primary commodities, the export of very low-end, low-value raw materials or intermediate goods. And therefore, you know, the tax or the export revenue that Angelica was talking about just towards the end of her presentation means that the revenues that we're generating are not really enough to sustain or even contribute to the transformation of economies and therefore the continent. And I think, you know, Peterson also touched on this. And so, you know, going back to sort of the basics there to understand, you know, to what extent does the lack of the transformation of economic structure contribute to the inability and vulnerability then therein of the continent So I think those are 2 points I really wanted to put out in the beginning. And the third one is borrowing for what? I think there's been a huge emphasis that about borrowing and there has to be now questions asked: what was governments borrowing for? Peterson did show a very nice graphic there around debt servicing, and you can see, debt servicing today completely dwarfs investment or spending on social services and social protection. So what has this debt that our governments have borrowed actually been used for? And there's been a lot of investment in very big mega infrastructure projects. I think one of the graphics that Angelica showed transport with a massive spike. And so these big long-term mega infrastructure projects that are often heavy private sector led in terms of how they're implemented is a major driver for the debt accumulation. This narrative that we need to invest in this big heavy infrastructure has really been one of the key drivers for the debt accumulation on the continent. And we can see, my own country in Kenya, the road network, the railway network, it looks great, but it's coming at a very high cost. The debts need to be paid immediately or close to immediately, whereas the return on those investments in terms of either tax revenues or economic growth or the jobs that have so often been promised in terms of opening up the economy do take a much longer period. So there is a huge lag in terms of the real benefits or the real return on these investments in mega infrastructure. And we've seen this across the continent where that has been a major push. So we need to really take a very deep, hard look at what are governments borrowing for and where they're investing, and whether these debts are actually yielding a positive return on these investments or from these debt investments. Because what ends up happening is that we're then in a cycle of a vicious cycle of borrowing to pay back loans, which is what we're currently doing. And I think the situation as a continent we find ourselves in today, to answer Angelica's PowerPoint, is there a looming crisis? I don't think there's a looming crisis. I think we are in a crisis already. There are defaults that have taken place or are likely to take place across the continent. We are seeing unprecedented measures being passed at global, continental, and national levels to try and safeguard the economies from collapse. So I think there's an important aspect there to look at in terms of questioning why is it that we have faced this we're faced with this sort of crisis. But I wanted to take a different sort of spin in the presentation, and this is something I did present it in another forum, but I thought was equally valuable for this discussion, given that we've focused very much on the role of some of the data in terms of the borrowing side of things, but also there's an important aspect to think about when we look at the debt relief and restructuring options that have been put to countries, and what does this mean in terms of the macroeconomic and fiscal policy aspects, but some political context, because none of these wonderful things happen without a political economy context. And I think this is extremely important also for the conversation. So there's this 4 points I'd like to talk about here. The debt crisis of the the late 90s and early 2000s led to the highly indebted poor country initiative, the multilateral debt relief initiatives that Angelica spoke about. And to a large extent, many African countries benefited from the full cancellation of the debt. But then for some reason, we've sort of, and the expectation there was, we find ourselves with this increased fiscal space. Governments can then, invest in other sectors and try and transform their economies. But lo and behold, in 2021, this is the position that we find ourselves in. And you know, we do have to ask ourselves some really tough questions about the current situation. So the graphic on the left, which would be your right, are countries that were approved under the HIPC initiative. And you know, the dates continue to evolve. It's like Somalia, for example, only just I think this year or last year got accepted. And then if you look at the graphic on your right, which might be your left, this is as of November last year. It's pretty much the same countries that benefited from the debt relief and debt cancellation under HIPC that are in risk of debt distress today, because of either that not using that fiscal space properly, or the problems that we have with the global financial and debt architecture, the proliferation of creditors. I think Angelica talked about that in her presentation. But you can see that, you know, really there's a severe problem that's happening there. And we need to ask ourselves the question around, why is this the case? It can't be that it's just, you know, misuse or graft that has led to this current situation. We need to ask ourselves harder questions, deeper questions. The global pandemic has shown how integral the continent of Africa is to global trade and global commerce. When trade stopped, when there were lockdowns, there was no travel, you could see very immediately, you know, what impact that was going to have on many African countries, because for all intents and purposes, the continent is a major supplier of raw materials into global industry, into global trade. Countries on the continent that depended on tourism, that depended on exports of natural resources, oil and gas, immediately felt a crunch and began to experience very soon, you know, there were predictions that there were going to be contractions in their economy. And so you can see how important and what an integral role the continent plays in that sense. And so when we're asking ourselves 20 years later after HIPC, why is it we're back in this situation? I think it's really about the fact that the global system or the global architecture that governs and regulates commerce, trade, finance hasn't evolved enough or hasn't evolved enough to accommodate a growing Africa with influence, and then a growing Africa that has a different history, not just in terms of economic history, but also political history. And so that system really has not worked for the continent in that way. And so what it has tried to do is adjust itself in different ways, make it more complex in terms of accessing different instruments, accessing different development partners or financing partners. And so what we end up having in the context of now the debt relief measures, we've got the debt service suspension initiative, and I think, you know, Peterson has touched on this. That has, you know, it is exactly what it says on the tin. It's a suspension. It's not, you know, it's not a cancellation. It's just a suspension. The debt will need to be paid after a period of time. I think they're now talking about 24 months after the end of this year, right? So, you know, it's not, again, it doesn't solve the more macro problem of the architecture in which lenders can lend in whatever way they want, and borrowers can borrow at will. So, you know, again, and the rules then around, for example, the G20 framework on the debt treatment excludes or fails to understand that Africa's creditor ecosystem has changed so much. You know, we no longer have the reliance on a certain group, perhaps from the global north and the multilaterals. We now have a huge proliferation of private creditors. We've got a huge other bilateral partners like China, like India, the Gulf states, you know, who have a very vested interest on the continent. And so we need to understand, how does that play out? But in the current context, in terms of the common framework, these aren't also necessarily taking into account the context that the continent is facing. So I think it's very important to have that political aspect and political appreciation for how the debt relief and the crisis in itself are being managed. And of course, when we're talking about macroeconomic and fiscal policy in the context of any sort of debt relief, debt cancellation, the question is, who is making the rules around this, right? And what is the position of African governments, policymakers, central bankers, academics in actually questioning whether the same rules that haven't been working over the past 20, 30 years, how is it possible that the same rules can be used in this current crisis? And what guarantees is it that they're going to work this time? And I've just, in this slide, I've just sort of talked about some of the initial things that we're beginning to see. So, it's all about conditions. All of the current initiatives will have a level of conditionality associated with them in one way or another. There's a high risk of austerity with regard to the fiscal space that might be created through any sort of debt relief. The biggest concern here is that the fiscal space that is created is actually swallowed up by having to appease private creditors, because private creditors aren't at the moment part of any debt relief measure or debt suspension initiative. So they're
Just
still
2 minutes, Jason.
Sure.
2 minutes, yeah.
They're being treated as a separate entity. So there is a bit of a concern there that the fiscal space will be eroded, that's being created through some of these initiatives. And so, what exactly then happens? And so this is the point I've made here, in terms of the rules being made by the perpetrators of the problems. I just wanted to touch very quickly on some of the issues regarding the COVID-19 specifically. I know there is a session after, but some of the things that we witnessed in the depths of the pandemic that gives us hope that governments can actually be proactive and be innovative. Here is an example of some of the countries on the continent that took very immediate measures to repurpose sort of domestic manufacturing. And this is quite significant politically, because it showed that the continent could actually repurpose its manufacturing to deal with the pandemic and provide things like PPE, sanitizing, and so on. So I think this is a very important aspect when we talk about how do we build forward together as a continent. And secondly, there is a need to think through certain aspects. The point here around service industry on the continent, there's a huge emphasis on services, whereas the trajectory many countries have taken is a traditional industrialization, manufacturing, which creates jobs and jobs for many people. So I think we need to think about that in terms of macroeconomic policy and the macroeconomic frameworks that can allow this. These are just a couple of slides just to show at the micro level some of the policy space that we had. And this is in reference specifically to Peterson's slide. Some of the countries that, some of the policy at the micro level that countries took. With regard to monetary policy specifically, we need to question, why is it that African countries did not have the space to lower interest rates like countries in Europe, in Asia, and in North America, to the extent that they could then borrow domestically, governments could have then borrowed domestically at a cheaper rate to then provide the fiscal support to some of our countries. So I think these are the kind of questions we need to be asking ourselves in the context of the economy. We do need to think about the political economy and also the ideological philosophy that's driving macroeconomic policy on the continent. Is the current philosophy and ideology guiding macroeconomic policy making working for the continent? To a large extent, I personally don't think it is, but this is perhaps the forum where we can have these type of questions and conversations. So I'll stop there for now. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much for that. Thank you to all of our speakers for those very comprehensive presentations and the time that you took to put them together. I think that a lot of people who are in the forum and who are watching online learned a lot, and we're seeing some questions coming through. So I'm going to pose some to everyone. We do have 15 minutes left, so I think that we are going to have one question round. So I'm going to pose all of the questions that we have to all of the speakers, and then can you just work through them and come up with an answer. We're going to give you about 4 minutes to answer so we can have a consolidation at the end and then have a closing off. So I want to just pose this question to the one that's been addressed to everyone. I'm going to pose it to Jason. So because you spoke about PPE and a large amount of the debt being used for PPP investments. So the question is from Wanja, and they ask, could we say that most of the debts countries are accumulating in SSA are a result of a lack of proper PPPs in investments by sub-Saharan African governments? And then to Angelica, the question is, what would you consider to be the solution to our debt situation? What metric is credible to use to show the problems, tax to GDP ratios? And then to Peterson, the question is, on average, if there's no external assistance, how long would it take most sub-Saharan African countries to pay off their current debt? Another one to Peterson, what about countries that decided to use the RCF? What would this mean for them in trying to get future credit? And I think just also in your answer, because the other two speakers got one question, I'd like to just ask, as rethinkers, as young economists, what advice you could give us to rethink debt. I think a lot of the presentations that you gave, you spoke to the immediate question of COVID-19 and also just addressing for future crises. But I would like us to, if you could briefly speak on how to rethink debt and how to, for us as young economists and policymakers in the future, how we can work to creating a better situation for Africa. So yeah, those are the questions. I think, can we have Jason first, since we need to give our civil society some space. Okay, can you go first? And then Angelica, can you go second? And then Peterson, can you go last? But we're very, very tight on time because it's going to cut off at 15:15. So please, can you keep it succinct?
Okay, great. So very quickly, I think the issue is not with public-private partnerships. I think the issue is that, there has been this narrative that has advocated for, supporting or increasing the role of the private sector in development finance. And the problem with that is, or the challenge with that is, private sector comes with a premium, right? Their role is to make money. And they make money at whatever costs. So I think at the micro level, those are things that we need to always keep in mind. The role of the private enterprise is not to give you a hospital. It's how many patients do we get in so that we can then pay the bills. So I think it's very important to keep that in mind, or to how many road users can we get to pay the toll fee so that we can pay the construction company. And this is the kind of problem we're facing with the big mega infrastructure investment projects, where the fees associated with using or accessing the service is being transferred to the citizen with the sole purpose of trying to pay off the private investor. And I think there's a sort of abdication of the role of the state here, where it's the state that should be taking that on. The second problem with the PPPs is that when you involve the private sector too much in development finance, you actually end up having to subsidize it, because most initiatives tend to be loss-making. And this is loss-making not in real terms, this is loss-making in accounting terms, because tax havens, illicit financial flows, aggressive corporate structuring means, again, private companies don't want to pay taxes. They want to maximize their revenues. So I think it's very important to understand that political economy. On debt is not bad, but if debt is used properly, responsibly, in a transparent and an accountable way, it can actually be a good supplement to other development finance instruments. But there's no taking away from it. Debt needs to lead to tax revenue. Debt should not lead to more debt, because then we're in problems. And that's the problem that the continent is facing. So debt should lead to tax revenue, not to more debt. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that. Angelica, can you please come in?
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. I also appreciate the presentation of my colleagues and for the very, very good insight. I like them, and I also learn a lot also. Now, what is the solution for the debt crisis, or always debt problem in Africa? So firstly, we need to understand, as Jason said, that debt should lead to more revenue and not lead to more debt, because debt is supposed to finance projects and programs by the government. So when the government borrow, usually there is a target project, target objective, but somehow in the process, there's so many holes in the system. And these funds the funds or the money intended to do that project doesn't reach the intended the destination of this debt. And also somehow also there is some sort of the cost of the project is inflated. So because of the rent-seeking behavior, also one of them, and there could be many other reasons. Now, I think in our paper, we have suggested some solution or some ways, strategy how to manage the debt in Africa. Firstly, there should be some transparency and accountability. Okay, this is not easy, but this should be a responsibility of both the lender and the borrower. There should be some transparency and accountability. Do we really need this, and who will benefit, and things like that? Because there are those cases where even these international transactions are being used to launder money. And there's so many examples there. If you search in the literature, they're there in public domain. You can see how these debt international transactions are being used to launder money. So also, it will if the lender and the borrower are not going to do their job. Now, it is very important that the civil society also do their part to demand from both borrower and lender accountability and transparency. So the civil society has also a job to do. Also, another way is if the government is committed to manage the debt, then they should rationalize expenditure, do some restructuring, just like, for example, in Kenya, before the IMF commit, recently there is a big chunk of money the IMF give to Kenya. They said before we have to have an agreement that there need to be restructuring. For example, those state corporations that are burdened should be restructured.
Thank you, Angelica. Just
thank you.
10 more seconds, you can just wrap it up. And then Peterson, can you come in? Okay, so okay. Peterson, can you go ahead? Yeah.
Okay, so thank you. I have two questions. The first question is, what about countries that decided to use the RCF? What would this mean for them in trying to get future credit? Okay, so I assume you're talking about the IMF's RCF. Now, the RCF comes with limited conditionality. Now, the problem is that any country that actually subscribes to this loan will have a debt signaling problem in the international credit market, because now creditors know that you're struggling, and to get future credit, they would charge a higher premium to such countries, right? Because you are collecting the RCF from the IMF, which means you're sending a signal that, hey, we don't have enough resources now. Our balance sheet, our balance of payment is in a bad shape. So future lenders who want to lend African countries in the future will take that into account and either refuse to lend or perhaps lend at a premium. Now, the second question is, I hope I've answered that question, Douglas. Second question from Gwen is, on average, if there is no external assistance, how long would it take for sub-Saharan countries to pay off their debt? I would say on average 7 years. For some, so that's the region on average, but for some African countries, it should take more. For more developed African countries like South Africa that have it should take less. Now, the reason I say 7 years is because it takes time. It takes approximately 2.5 years to develop infrastructure, and also take another 1.5 years to generate revenue from infrastructure, generate revenue to sustain the infrastructure, and then get additional revenue to contribute to the broader macroeconomy and GDP. So I would say it should take approximately 7 years to repay debt, the debt owed by the entire region. But of course, during this time, there need to be significant restructuring to build infrastructure, invest in fiscal infrastructure that lead and contribute to GDP. I think I will stop here because of time.
Perfect. Thank you for that. And thank you to every speaker for the very compelling conversation. I think it's sad that we run out of time, because I think that we all would have wanted to hear more and more of some of the work that you're doing and of your presentations. I'm going to, so it looks like we can have the shortest closing round, but I want to say for people who are looking for the slides, because I saw a comment on that, it will be up on the website. This conversation will be put up on the Rethinking Economics for Africa page on Facebook and other social media sites. But you can also contact the speakers. I've asked them to put their contact details, so maybe their social media or their email addresses in the chat. So if you have any more questions, maybe reach out to them, because I know that we didn't have enough time to engage. So if you want more of a robust engagement, if they're open to it, I think that you should go for that. So yeah, those are the details. So the details will be in the chat. Everything will be put online. So these slides for you to access and to read over as well. So thank you to all of the speakers. Please, can you just say one last thing in the next 3 minutes, so a minute each, and then we can wrap up. And thank you to everyone for joining the discussion today. I think that we've had a really great time. Please enjoy the rest of the festival, and hope to see you next year as well. So let's have Jason, our civil society member. We have to prioritize you, of course, and then go on to Angelica and then Peterson again. So yeah.
Thanks. No, look, it's great to be part of this conversation. I'll just say to all the students and those who are thinking about development economics or macroeconomics, don't be afraid to think outside the box. Yeah, that's what I'll say. Be creative, be innovative, and think about creative ways in which we can advance the continent. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much for everyone who is interested in this conversation. And yes, we should continue to talk. And I have put my email in the chat. So if you want to have more questions or comments on what I have said, then you are most welcome. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So thank you for inviting me for this conference. And I actually took some time to actually research the Institute and what they've been doing and the REFA Festival for the past 2 years. And I think what you guys are doing is great. Please continue to do so. And for those of us who are interested in economics and challenging existing assumptions and mainstream thinking, I think it's something worth doing. And I think through this platform, I think something great is going to come out from this. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. Thank you to everyone, and hope everyone has a good evening or morning or wherever you are in the day. Cheers.
Thank you, Segu.
Great.
Bye.
Thank you. Cheers. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.